Nora Jenkins stood by the window of the cold parlor in Boston. The fire had died hours ago, leaving nothing but gray ash in the stone hearth. Outside, the winter snow covered the brick streets, turning the city into a silent white sheet. 3 days ago, the bank had taken her father's remaining assets to pay off the massive debts left behind after his sudden death. 2 days ago, the morning papers had printed every detail of the family ruin, making her the subject of whispered gossip across every parlor in the city. Then, just this morning, a short note arrived from Peter Gable, the man she was supposed to marry in the spring, stating that their engagement was over because he could not tie his name to a scandal. Now she was entirely alone in a house that no longer belonged to her, wondering how she would survive the coming week when the front door opened without a knock. A man walked into the room, bringing a wave of freezing air with him. He did not bow or offer a polite greeting. He simply stood in the center of the fading parlor, looking at Nora with an intensity that made the room feel even smaller than it was. He was tall, dressed in a long coat of heavy black wool that looked incredibly expensive against the worn furniture. His hair was completely white, falling straight and neat around a face that was strikingly pale, almost like carved marble. His features were sharp, his skin perfectly clear and white, and his eyes were dark, deep pools that seemed to notice every crack in the walls and every tear in Nora's simple black dress. He took off his leather gloves slowly, one finger at a time, and placed them in his pocket before he spoke in a low, calm voice that filled the quiet room. "Miss Jenkins," he said, "I have come to offer you a proposition of marriage." Nora stared at him, her hands tightening around the wooden back of an old dining chair. The word marriage seemed absurd in the freezing room, sounding loud and strange against the quiet of the empty house, where all the servants had already fled. "Sir," she said slowly, trying to keep her voice from shaking as the cold air bit into her lungs, "I think you have come to the wrong address." The white-haired man did not look like someone who made mistakes. He stepped closer, his movements completely silent, his pale face remaining perfectly still. "I am Silas Mercer," he said, and the name alone caused a chill to run down her spine. For everyone in Boston knew the Mercer family owned half the shipping docks and real estate in the state, though few had ever seen the master of the estate in daylight. "I am never mistaken about my destinations, Miss Jenkins, and I am certainly not mistaken now." Nora forced herself to look directly into his dark eyes, refusing to let him see how terrified she truly was. "Then you must know that I have nothing left to my name," she said, her voice sharpening with a desperate kind of pride. "My father's business is gone, the creditors are coming for this house by the end of the month, and my family name is completely ruined in society." Silas Mercer listened to her without a single change in his expression, his white skin reflecting the faint winter light coming through the frost-covered windows. "I read the newspapers, Miss Jenkins," he replied evenly, his voice smooth and devoid of any judgment. "I am fully aware of your financial situation, and I am fully aware of the gossip that follows you." A heavy silence settled between them, so deep that Nora could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. She looked at his pale hands, noting how steady they were, entirely unaffected by the bitter cold that made her own fingers numb. Silas walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the snow-covered street where a black carriage waited in the shadows. "You will be forced to leave this place within 20 days, he said, without turning around to look at her, his voice carrying a quiet precision. "You have no relatives to turn to, and your former friends will not open their doors to a ruined woman. You will likely search for work as a teacher or a companion, but your father's reputation will ensure that no respectable family employs you." Nora bit her lip, her fingernails digging deeply into the palms of her hands as his words tore away her remaining illusions. "And why should that matter to a man like you, Mr. Mercer?" she demanded, taking a step forward to face his back. Silas turned around slowly, his white hair catching the dim light of the afternoon sky. "Because I require a wife," he said simply, as though he were discussing the purchase of a new piece of land or a shipping vessel. Nora let out a short, bitter laugh that held no real humor. "You are one of the wealthiest men in Boston," she said, her disbelief clear in every word. "The city is filled with young ladies from prominent families who would gladly accept your name. Why would you come to a frozen house to ask a ruined woman?" Silas studied her face with a strange, unsettling patience that made her feel completely exposed. Because women who have lost everything have fewer illusions about the world, he said, his voice dropping to a lower register. Nora's breath caught in her throat as she understood the subtle meaning behind his words. "You mean that I would not expect anything from you," she said slowly, her mind working quickly to piece together his motives. "You mean I would make fewer demands on your time and your life?" Silas nodded once, his pale features remaining perfectly composed. "Exactly," he said. "Offering you complete financial protection, a home that cannot be taken from you, and a position that will force the rest of society to bow to you regardless of what the newspapers print." Snow began to tap softly against the glass behind him, and the room seemed to grow even darker as the sun began to set. Nora looked down at the floor, thinking of the unpaid bills sitting on her desk and the hollow ache of hunger that had been her constant companion for the past 2 days. "Do you think I am so desperate that I would sell my life to a stranger?" she asked quietly. Silas did not flinch at her words. "I think you are practical, Miss Jenkins," he said, his dark eyes fixed on her. "You are completely alone. You have no money, and you have no allies left in this city. I am offering you safety from the winter and from the people who abandoned you this morning." Nora looked at him, realizing that every word he spoke was completely true, no matter how much she hated to admit it. "And what do you gain from this arrangement, Mr. Mercer?" she asked, her voice steadying as she focused on the reality of the situation. Silas allowed a faint, humorless smile to touch his pale lips for a fraction of a second. "A wife who has no expectations of romance," he said softly. "No interfering family members to question my business, and no sentimental ideas about marriage. I require a partner who understands the value of a clean transaction." Nora felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You want obedience," she said. "No," Silas corrected her immediately, stepping closer until she could smell the faint scent of winter and old paper that clung to him. "I want honesty. I will protect you from every creditor in Boston, and you will never know hunger or cold again. In return, you will bear my name." Nora felt her heart beating rapidly against her ribs, the sound loud in her own ears. "And what of affection?" she asked, almost whispering the question. Silas's expression hardened, his dark eyes turning as cold as obsidian. "That is not part of the agreement, Miss Jenkins," he said firmly. The answer should have made it easy to refuse him, but then she thought of the empty kitchen downstairs, the cold bed waiting for her, and the bitter winter outside. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. Silas walked toward the door, pulling his leather gloves back over his pale hands. "Until tomorrow at noon," he said, opening the door to let in another rush of wind. "A carriage will arrive at 12 o'clock. If you step inside, I will know you accept. If not, I will not return." Then he stepped out into the snow, leaving Nora alone in the freezing parlor to face the choice between a life of ruin or a marriage to the most dangerous man in the city. Nora Jenkins did not sleep at all during the long winter night. The empty house seemed filled with strange creaks and heavy shadows that moved across the walls whenever the wind blew against the loose window frames. She sat at her father's old mahogany desk, the single candle burning down to a small puddle of wax, while she stared at the short letter Peter Gable had sent her that morning. 3 lines of ink were all it took to destroy 8 months of promises and plans for a quiet life together. He had written that the circumstances surrounding her family made it impossible for him to fulfill his obligations to her. Nora folded the paper slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, but she did not cry. She had no tears left for a man who lacked the courage to face her in person, a man who fled the moment the storm began. Across the city in the historic district of Beacon Hill, Silas Mercer sat alone in his private study. The room was dark, illuminated only by a single green-shaded lamp on a massive walnut desk covered in legal documents and heavy ledgers. His white hair caught the faint light as he leaned back in his chair, his perfectly pale face completely relaxed in the shadows. Standing across from him was Mr. Finch, his longtime lawyer and advisor, who was adjusting his spectacles while looking over a newly drafted marriage contract. "Sir," the older man said carefully, his voice breaking the absolute quiet of the grand house, "are you entirely certain about this decision? Miss Jenkins is in a very difficult position, and her family name is currently the subject of great scandal throughout the city." Did not look up from the papers, his pale fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic pattern against the polished wood of the desk. "That is precisely why she is the correct choice, Mr. Finch," he replied, his voice low and steady. "A woman from a wealthy family would bring expectations of society dinners, summer travels, and constant public appearances. Miss Jenkins requires shelter and a name to shield her from ruin, which means she will be content with the privacy I demand." The lawyer hesitated, turning a page of the contract with a slight frown. "But the public will talk, sir. They will wonder why the master of the Mercer estate has suddenly married a merchant's daughter who possesses no dowry and no living relatives to support her." Silas rose from his chair with a smooth, silent movement that seemed almost unnatural in its grace. He walked over to the tall glass windows that looked out over the dark gardens of the estate, where the snow covered the brick walls and stone pathways. "Let them talk," he said quietly, his reflection showing his stark white hair and pale skin against the black glass of the window. "They have whispered about my family for over 50 years, Mr. Finch, and those whispers have never changed the amount of power we hold in this city. My distant cousins are already watching the estate like wolves, waiting for me to leave no heir so they can claim the shipping lines. A marriage will silence them completely, and an heir will ensure the property remains exactly where it belongs." The lawyer gave a slow nod, recognizing the cold logic that governed every decision his employer made. "And what of the young lady herself?" Mr. Finch asked, closing the legal folder. "She is human, sir. She may expect more than simple financial security once she realizes the true nature of this house." Silas kept his back to the room, his eyes fixed on the falling snow outside. "She is a practical woman," he said softly. "I saw it in her eyes when I stood in her cold parlor today. She did not beg, and she did not scream. She simply weighed her options like a merchant's daughter. She knows that survival is the only thing I am offering her, and she is smart enough to take it." The next morning arrived with a pale gray sky that brought no warmth to the frozen streets of Boston. Nora stood in the front hallway of her house, wearing her only remaining heavy coat over her black wool dress. A small leather bag sat at her feet, containing nothing but a few changes of clothing, her mother's old silver pocket watch, and a handful of books. The rest of her belongings had already been catalogued by the bank to be sold at an auction the following week. She looked at the grandfather clock in the hall as the large hands slowly moved toward 12 o'clock. Every tick sounded like a hammer against her chest, a reminder that her time in the only home she had ever known was coming to an end. Exactly at noon, the heavy sound of carriage wheels grinding against the icy cobblestones echoed through the quiet street. Nora walked to the front door and opened it slowly, her breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. A large black carriage drawn by two dark horses had stopped directly in front of her walkway. The driver, an older man wrapped in a thick wool coat, sat silently on the box, his eyes fixed forward. The carriage door opened, and Silas Mercer stepped down onto the snowy pavement. He looked exactly as he had the day before, his white hair perfectly neat, his white skin contrasting sharply with his dark clothing, his face completely unreadable as he looked up at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke a word across the short distance of the snowy yard. Nora took a deep breath, looking back one last time at the dark hallway behind her, the rooms where she had spent her childhood, and the empty rooms where her father used to sit by the fire. The house was dead now, cold and silent, offering her nothing but memories of a life that could never return. She turned her back on the past, picked up her small leather bag, and walked down the steps toward the waiting carriage. Her boots crunched loudly in the fresh snow, the sound breaking the quiet of the winter afternoon. Silas stood by the carriage door, extending a pale hand to help her step up into the vehicle. Nora hesitated for a brief second, looking at his long, pale fingers before she placed her gloved hand in his. His grip was firm and steady, but his skin was surprisingly cold, colder than the winter air around them. "I accept your offer, Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, looking directly into his dark eyes. Silas inclined his head once, a simple gesture of acknowledgement that held no victory or joy. "Then, let us proceed to the chapel, Miss Jenkins," he said, helping her into the carriage before climbing in behind her and closing the heavy door, shutting out the rest of the world. The chapel was much smaller than Nora had imagined it would be when they arrived. Tucked away behind a row of high stone walls, in the older section of Boston. It was a private family chapel built of dark gray granite and surrounded by bare elm trees. Inside, the air was dim and cool, smelling faintly of dried pine and old candle wax. There were no bright flowers decorating the altar, no music playing from the balcony, and no crowd of guests waiting to see the bride. The only people present were the old minister, Silas's lawyer, Mr. Finch, and an elderly woman named Martha, who had served as Nora's housekeeper until the money ran out 3 days ago and had refused to let her mistress go alone. Nora stood at the back of the narrow stone aisle, her fingers grasping her small bouquet of simple winter greenery so tightly that the stems bit into her palms. She looked down at her dress, an ivory wool gown that Mrs. Weaver, Silas's head servant, had delivered to her room at the Mercer estate just an hour before the ceremony. It fit her perfectly, wrapping around her frame with a quiet elegance that felt completely foreign to her current life. Across the small chapel, Silas Mercer stood near the altar, waiting for her with a stillness that was almost frightening. He wore a dark formal suit, the sharp lines of his coat emphasizing his tall stature, his white hair gleaming under the faint light of a dozen white candles. When Nora began to walk forward, the sound of her soft leather shoes against the stone floor seemed to echo loudly in the quiet building. Silas watched her approach without moving a muscle, his dark eyes fixed on her face, with a level of concentration that made her heart race. When she finally reached his side, he did not smile or whisper a word of reassurance. He simply turned toward the minister, his pale profile looking like a statue against the dark wood of the altar. "We are gathered here to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony," the minister began, his deep voice carrying through the small room with a slow, heavy rhythm. Nora tried to focus on the traditional words of the ceremony, but her mind felt disconnected from reality, floating somewhere above the stone floor. She was marrying a man she had known for less than 24 hours, a man who had openly admitted that he wanted her only because she was ruined and had no expectations of love. She looked at Silas's pale face, noticing how his white skin seemed almost translucent under the candlelight, completely devoid of the flush that usually came with a winter cold. "Do you, Silas Mercer, take this woman to be your wedded wife?" the minister asked, his eyes looking over his glasses at the tall man. "I do," Silas said, his voice resonant and completely steady, without a hint of hesitation or doubt. The minister then turned his gaze toward Nora, his face softening with a look of quiet sympathy that she did not want. "Do you, Nora Jenkins, take this man to be your wedded husband?" Nora took a slow, deep breath, forcing her voice to remain clear as she spoke the words that would change her life forever. "I do," she said, her voice sounding small but firm in the quiet chapel. She felt Martha let out a soft sigh behind her, a sound of relief mixed with worry for the future. The minister nodded and instructed Silas to produce the ring. Silas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a simple, thick band of yellow gold, completely unadorned by diamonds or elaborate carvings. He took Nora's left hand in his long, pale fingers wrapping around her smaller ones. The touch sent another jolt of cold through her skin, a deep, icy sensation that seemed to settle in her bones. Yet his grip was remarkably gentle as he slid the gold band onto her finger. "With this ring I wed you," Silas murmured, his dark eyes meeting hers for a brief, intense second that made her forget the cold. The minister smiled faintly and closed his heavy leather book with a soft thud. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," he said. "You may seal your vows with a kiss." Nora felt her muscles tense as Silas turned fully toward her, leaning down slowly so that his white hair brushed against her cheek. His lips touched hers for a single moment, a brief and formal gesture that held no passion or warmth. His lips were as cold as ice, smooth and dry, yet there was a sudden, strange pause before he pulled away, a fraction of a second where his dark eyes widened slightly, as though he had detected something unexpected in her touch. Then the moment passed, and Silas stepped back into his usual composed stance, his face returning to its unreadable mask. "It is finished," Mr. Finch said from the side, stepping forward with the heavy marriage register for them to sign. Silas took the fountain pen first, signing his name with a series of quick, sharp strokes that were perfectly aligned with the ink line. Nora took the pen from his hand, her fingers still feeling the chill of his touch, as she carefully wrote her new name for the very first time. Nora Mercer. It looked strange on the white paper, a marker of a new identity she had not yet learned to understand. They walked out of the chapel together, the cold winter air striking their faces as they stepped into the afternoon light. Silas offered his arm, and Nora placed her hand upon the heavy wool of his sleeve, feeling the solid strength of his form beneath the cloth. The black carriage was waiting by the iron gates, the horses tossing their heads in the cold air. "Where do we go now, Silas?" Nora asked quietly as they reached the carriage door. Silas looked down at her, his dark eyes steady. "You are my wife now, Nora," he said calmly. "We go home to the Mercer estate, where your new life begins." The Mercer estate was situated on a high hill overlooking the harbor, a massive stone house built of gray granite that looked like a fortress against the winter sky. High iron gates opened silently to let the carriage pass, closing behind them with a heavy clang that sounded entirely permanent. The grounds were vast and filled with old oak trees, whose bare branches reached upward like thin fingers through the gray fog. When the carriage stopped before the wide stone steps of the main entrance, Nora looked up at the dozens of dark windows, feeling a sense of smallness that she had never experienced in her father's comfortable townhouse. Inside, the grand entrance hall was a cavern of black marble and white stone, with a sweeping staircase that disappeared into the shadows of the upper floors. Tall portraits of pale, dark-eyed men and women lined the walls, their cold gazes following Nora as she stepped into the center of the hall. Mrs. Weaver, a stern woman dressed in immaculate gray silk, stood waiting to receive them with a low bow. "Welcome home, sir," the housekeeper said before turning her sharp eyes toward Nora. "And welcome to the estate, madam. Your rooms have been prepared exactly as the master instructed, with a fire in every room to ward off the cold." Nora followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase, her leather shoes making no sound against the thick dark carpets that covered the stone steps. Her new quarters consisted of a private sitting room, a large dressing chamber, and a bedchamber that was wider than her entire old house. A massive fire burned brightly in the stone fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows across the dark velvet curtains and heavy mahogany furniture. It was a room filled with immense luxury, yet it felt completely untouched by human life, like a display in a shop window rather than a place where someone lived and slept. "Dinner is served precisely at 7 o'clock in the formal dining room, Madam Mrs." Weaver said, adjusting a silver candlestick on the table. "The master expects punctuality above all things." Nora thanked her and sat down by the fire, holding her hands out toward the flames to chase away the deep chill that had settled in her fingers since the chapel. She spent the remaining hours of the afternoon unpacking her small leather bag, placing her few items into the vast drawers of the mahogany wardrobe where they looked incredibly lonely against the empty dark wood. When the clock in the hall struck 7 times, Nora made her way down the grand staircase to the dining room. A long table of polished oak stretched across the center of the room, lit by dozens of white candles that cast a flickering light on the silver plates and crystal glasses. Silas Mercer was already standing by the grand fireplace at the far end of the room, holding a glass filled with a dark red liquid that caught the light of the flames. He had changed into a simple black evening coat, his white hair combed back from his pale forehead, his dark eyes watching her as she walked toward her seat. "You are on time," Silas observed, as a silent servant pulled out a chair for her at the head of the table, opposite his own seat. "I try to keep my promises, Silas," Nora replied, taking her seat and smoothing the skirts of her ivory dress. Silas walked to his end of the table and sat down, setting his glass aside without drinking from it. "In this house, we are partners now," he said quietly, his pale hands resting against the dark wood of the table. "There is no need for formal titles between us when we are alone in these rooms." Servants appeared from the shadows, placing dishes of roasted meat and winter vegetables before Nora, while leaving Silas's plate completely empty except for a small dish of rare fruit. Nora watched him carefully, noting that he did not touch the food, his dark eyes remaining fixed on her face as she began to eat. The silence between them grew heavy, broken only by the faint click of her silver fork against the porcelain plate. "You do not eat, Silas?" she asked finally, unable to bear the quiet any longer. "I have specific dietary needs, Nora," he replied smoothly, his pale face remaining perfectly still. "Do not concern yourself with my plate. Ensure you enjoy your own." Nora set her fork down, looking across the long expanse of the table at her white-haired husband. "This house is very large," she said quietly, her voice sounding small in the vast room. "And very quiet." Silas leaned back in his chair, his white skin looking almost ghostly in the dim candlelight. "Quietness is a quality I value highly," he said. "It allows for thought and reflection. My late sister, Lydia, used to say the same thing before she passed away 3 years ago in this very house." Nora felt a sudden surge of curiosity, looking up at a portrait that hung above the fireplace, showing a young woman with the same pale skin but light silver hair. "She looks beautiful," Nora said softly, studying the painted features of the sister who had died. "She was stubborn," Silas said, his voice carrying a subtle hint of emotion that she had not heard before. "She refused to leave the estate during the winter fever, believing she could help the tenants in the valley. By the time I returned from my business in the city, the sickness had already taken her." Nora saw his pale hand tighten around the stem of his glass, his dark eyes fixed on the portrait with a deep, silent regret that seemed to fill the room. "I am sorry for your loss," Nora said gently, realizing that beneath his cold exterior and strange pale appearance, this man carried a heavy weight from his past. Silas looked back at her, his expression instantly smoothing into his usual, unreadable mask. "Do not waste your sympathy on the past, Nora," he said coldly, rising from his chair to signal the end of the meal. "The contract is signed, and we have our arrangement. Sleep well tonight, for tomorrow you begin your duties as the mistress of this estate." Then he walked out into the shadows, leaving her alone with the flickering candles and the silent gaze of the dead sister. A week passed in a blur of quiet routines and gray winter mornings. Nora quickly learned that living with Silas Mercer meant living alongside a shadow that rarely appeared during the daylight hours. He spent his days locked away in his private study or attending to business down at the Boston shipping docks, only returning to the grand estate long after the sun had set beneath the harbor line. Nora spent her time managing the household accounts with Mrs. Weaver, reviewing the kitchen menus, and walking through the long, silent corridors of the stone mansion where the air always carried a faint, crisp chill. Despite the comfort of her warm rooms and the abundance of excellent food, Nora felt a growing sense of isolation that began to weigh on her spirits. Every evening followed the exact same pattern. She would sit at the long dining table. Silas would join her from the shadows. They would exchange polite words about the estate, and then he would withdraw to his study. There was no anger between them, no harsh words, but there was an absolute lack of human warmth that made her feel as though she were living inside a beautiful, expensive tomb. One rainy Tuesday evening, Nora decided she could no longer maintain the polite facade that had grown between them like a wall of ice. As the servants cleared away her dinner plates, she remained seated, her dark eyes fixed on Silas, who was turning his glass of dark red liquid in his pale fingers. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and firm in the quiet room. Silas paused his movements, his white hair catching the yellow light of the candles as he looked up at her. "Yes, Nora. Is there an issue with the household accounts?" "No," Nora replied, leaning forward slightly and placing her hands flat on the polished table. "The accounts are perfect, Mrs. Weaver is very efficient, and the servants are completely attentive. The problem is not the house, Silas. The problem is you." A faint crease appeared between Silas's pale brows, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her face. "I am unaware of any failure on my part," he said coldly. "I have paid every debt your father left behind, and I have given you total security." "You have given me shelter, Silas," Nora said, her voice rising slightly with the frustration she had kept hidden for days. "You have given me clothes and safety from the creditors, and I am grateful for that. But you have not given me a life. You sit across from me every night, like a stranger who has rented a room in my house, looking through me as if I do not exist beyond the terms of our legal contract." Silas rose from his chair slowly, his white skin looking exceptionally sharp against his dark evening coat. "We agreed on a practical arrangement, Nora," he said, his voice dropping to a low, warning register. "I told you that affection was not part of the deal." "I am not asking for love, Silas," Nora countered, standing up to face him across the long distance of the table. "I am asking for an acknowledgement that there is a living person in this house with you. I am asking you to be present when you are in the room, rather than hiding behind your silence and your shadows. If I am to spend the rest of my days as your wife, I refuse to live as a ghost in your halls." Silas stood perfectly still for a long moment, the fire crackling softly behind him, casting red glints into his dark eyes. He walked slowly toward her end of the table, his movements so smooth and silent that he seemed to glide across the dark carpet. When he stopped just a few feet away, Nora could feel the cold radiating from him, a deep winter chill that seemed to belong to the night itself. "I am not a man who is skilled at companionship, Nora," he said quietly, his pale features softening just a fraction. "I have spent a very long time alone, and I have forgotten how to share a space with someone who is different from me." Nora looked into his dark eyes, seeing a sudden vulnerability there that surprised her, a contrast to his usual terrifying calm. "Then you must learn, Silas," she said softly, taking a step closer until she could see the delicate lines around his eyes. "You married a human woman, not a piece of marble furniture. You cannot simply lock me in a room and expect me to be content with 3 meals a day and a fire in the hearth." Silas looked down at her small hands, his white hair falling slightly forward over his brow. A very faint smile, barely more than a softening of his lips, appeared on his pale face for the first time since she had known him. "You are remarkably brave for a woman who was ruined a week ago, Nora," he murmured, his voice holding a hint of genuine amusement. "And you are remarkably stubborn for a man who claims to be entirely practical," she replied, a small smile appearing on her own lips in return. The heavy tension that had filled the dining room for days seemed to break in that single moment, leaving behind a fragile new understanding between them. Silas inclined his head slowly, his dark eyes remaining fixed on hers with a warmth that she had not thought him capable of showing. "Very well, Nora," he said softly. "I will endeavor to be more present. Tomorrow I will show you the library, and perhaps we can find a way to speak of things other than the household bills." Nora felt her heart give a strange, unexpected flutter in her chest as he turned and walked out of the room, realizing that the white-haired master of the estate was far more complex than she had ever imagined. The next afternoon, Nora went to the estate library, a vast room that occupied the entire western wing of the stone house. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with dark mahogany shelves packed with thousands of old books, their leather bindings smelling of old paper and dried leaves. High-arched windows looked out over the gray Boston harbor, letting in the dim winter light that bounced off the brass rolling ladders and heavy reading tables. It was the warmest room in the house, filled with thick rugs and comfortable leather chairs that sat before a massive stone fireplace where a bright fire crackled. As Nora searched the shelves for something to read, her eyes caught a small, leather-bound journal lying half-hidden beneath a stack of old shipping ledgers on Silas's private desk. She knew she should not touch his personal papers, but a strange curiosity drew her forward until her fingers brushed the cold leather cover. The journal fell open to a page, written in a sharp, precise handwriting that she recognized instantly as Silas's. The entry was dated exactly 3 years ago during the winter his sister Lydia had died of the fever. "I could have saved her," the words read, written with a fierce intensity that seemed to jump off the white page. "If I had revealed the truth of my nature, if I had given her the blood that keeps me alive, she would still be walking these halls. But I was afraid of what she would think of her brother, and so I let her die like a human. I will never allow myself to care for a mortal life again, for the loss is a coldness that even my frozen heart cannot endure." Nora felt the breath leave her lungs as she read the lines, her mind spinning as the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. The pale white skin that never felt the sun, the white hair, the icy touch of his fingers, the refusal to eat regular food, and the terrifying calm that surrounded him like a shroud. He was not simply an eccentric wealthy man. Silas Mercer was something ancient and different, a creature of the night who ruled his empire from the shadows of the city. A soft sound caused her to turn around quickly, her heart pounding against her ribs as she saw Silas standing in the doorway of the library, his white hair looking stark against the dark wood of the frame. His dark eyes moved from her pale face down to the open journal on his desk, his expression instantly turning into a cold, terrifying mask of anger. "You should not have read that, Nora," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. He crossed the space between them in a split second, moving faster than any human eye could follow, until he stood directly over her, his pale face inches from her own. Nora braced herself, expecting him to strike her or throw her from the house, but she refused to look away from his dark eyes. "I am not sorry I read it, Silas," she said, her voice shaking slightly but remaining firm as she faced his anger. "Now I finally understand why you keep this house like a tomb, and why you are so afraid to look at me." Silas let out a short, bitter laugh that held a deep hidden pain. "Afraid," he repeated, his long, pale fingers tightening into fists at his sides. "I am the master of this city, Nora. I have lived for over 100 years while generations of your people have turned to dust. I am not afraid of anything." "You are afraid of losing someone else, Silas," Nora said softly, reaching out with a sudden bravery to place her hand against his cold arm. "You think that because I am human, I am fragile, and that if you allow yourself to know me, you will have to watch me die just like your sister. So you hide behind your contracts and your rules, pretending that you are a monster who feels nothing, when the truth is you are simply a man who is drowning in his own guilt." Silas stiffened at her touch, his dark eyes searching her face with a desperate, wounded intensity that tore at her heart. The silence stretched between them for a long time, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the vast library, as the anger slowly drained from his pale features, leaving behind an expression of profound exhaustion. "You do not run away from me," he whispered, looking down at her hand against his sleeve. "You know what I am now, Nora. You know that I am a creature who lives on the life of others, yet you do not scream or beg for mercy." Nora gave a soft, gentle shake of her head, her fingers tightening slightly against his arm. "I have seen true monsters, Silas," she said quietly, thinking of Peter Gable, who had abandoned her in the dark, and the creditors who had laughed at her father's ruin. "They are the men who wear fine smiles and break their promises the moment the world turns cold. You have been honest with me since the day you walked into my frozen parlor, and you have kept every word of your agreement. I am not afraid of your white hair or your cold skin, Silas. I am only afraid of living with a husband who refuses to let himself live." Silas looked at her for a long moment, a strange, deep light shining in his dark eyes as he slowly placed his pale hand over hers. "Then I will try to learn, Nora," he said softly, his voice carrying a genuine promise that filled the quiet library with a sudden, beautiful warmth. The social season in Boston continued despite the bitter winter weather, and 2 days after their conversation in the library, the Mercer family received an invitation to the grand winter ball hosted by the wealthy Harrington family. Normally, Silas would have ignored such an event, preferring the quiet safety of his dark study, but that morning Mr. Finch had brought a copy of the city newspaper to the house. A small gossip column had printed a cruel paragraph about Nora, calling her a penniless merchant's daughter, who had tricked the wealthy master of the estate into a sudden marriage to escape her father's debts. When Silas read the words, a cold, dark fury had settled over his pale face, though he said nothing to Nora about it. Instead, he instructed Mrs. Weaver to prepare the finest dark green silk zounden for his wife and announced that they would be attending the ball that evening. When Nora descended the grand staircase at 8 o'clock, Silas was waiting for her in the hall, looking magnificent in a formal black suit that emphasized his stark white hair and pale skin. He looked up at her as she reached the bottom step, his dark eyes flashing with a quiet appreciation that made her cheeks flush with a sudden warmth. The Harrington ballroom was a dazzling display of crystal chandeliers, gold mirrors, and hundreds of wealthy guests dressed in fine silks and velvets. A small orchestra played a lively tune from the balcony, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter and whispered conversations. As the butler announced their arrival, the entire room seemed to fall into a sudden, heavy silence, every eye turning toward the doorway, where the white-haired master of the Mercer estate stood with his new wife upon his arm. Nora felt a wave of nervousness wash over her as she felt the weight of their staring eyes, but Silas placed his cold, steady hand over her fingers, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "Keep your head high, Nora," he murmured near her ear, his low voice steadying her racing heart. "You are the mistress of the Mercer estate, and none of these people have the right to look down upon you." They walked into the crowd, the guests parting before them like water before a shipping vessel, their whispers following them across the polished ballroom floor. The inevitable confrontation occurred near the refreshment tables, where Peter Gable was standing, with a group of young businessmen. When he saw Nora approaching, his face turned a deep red before he smoothed his features into a polite, arrogant smile and stepped forward to block their path. "Good evening, Nora," Peter said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. "I must congratulate you on your sudden good fortune. It seems you found a way to resolve your family debts much faster than anyone in the city expected." Nora felt the old humiliation sting her throat, but before she could speak a word, Silas stepped slightly ahead of her, his tall form casting a long shadow over the younger man. His white skin looked blindingly sharp under the bright chandeliers, and his dark eyes turned as cold as black ice as he looked down at Peter. "You will address my wife as the mistress of this estate, sir," Silas said, his voice low, but carrying a terrifying authority that caused the surrounding crowd to hold its breath. "And you will speak to her with the respect that her position demands, or I will ensure your family business never sees another cargo ship enter Boston Harbor." Peter's arrogant smile vanished instantly, his face turning completely pale as he looked into the dark, bottomless eyes of the white-haired man. He bowed quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he stepped back into the crowd. "Forgive me, sir," Peter stammered, before turning and disappearing into the ballroom. Nora looked up at Silas, a deep sense of relief and admiration filling her heart as she realized that he had protected her honor far better than any human man ever could. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered, her fingers tightening around his arm. "I told you I would protect you from the world, Nora," Silas said softly, his dark eyes turning back to her with a gentle light. The orchestra began to play a slow, beautiful waltz, and Silas extended his pale hand toward her with a quiet grace. "Will you dance with me, Nora?" he asked. Nora smiled, placing her small hand in his cold palm. "I would be delighted, Silas," she replied, as he led her into the center of the ballroom floor under the light of 1,000 candles. As they moved together to the rhythm of the music, the rest of the world seemed to fade away into a blur of color and sound, leaving only the two of them in the center of the room. Silas moved with an effortless, supernatural grace, his pale face relaxed as he held her close against his chest. "You are a very good dancer for a man who hates crowds," Nora noted softly, looking up into his white hair. "I am learning to enjoy the things that bring you joy, Nora," he whispered back, his cold lips brushing against her forehead in a gesture that felt entirely real and full of a quiet, growing love. The carriage ride back to the estate was quiet, but it was a comfortable, warm silence that held none of the distance from their early days together. The snow had begun to fall again, covering the city streets in a fresh blanket of white that muffled the sound of the horses' hooves. Inside the carriage, Nora sat close to Silas, her hand resting inside his large, pale palm, where the skin felt slightly warmer than it ever had before, as though the life in her own body was slowly thawing the ice in his. When they reached the grand house, Silas helped her down from the carriage and walked with her up the stone steps into the warm entrance hall. Mrs. Weaver had left a single lamp burning on the table, casting a soft, golden glow across the black marble floors and the old portraits on the walls. Silas turned to face her, his white hair slightly dusted with fresh snow, his dark eyes soft as he looked down at her emerald dress. "Go up to your room and get some rest, Nora," he said gently, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "It has been a very long night for you." "Will you join me for breakfast tomorrow, Silas?" Nora asked, holding his gaze with a hopeful smile. Silas paused for a moment, his pale features reflecting the soft light of the lamp, before he gave a slow, decisive nod. "I will be there at 8 o'clock, Nora," he promised softly. "We will review the plans for the spring gardens together." Nora felt a deep sense of peace fill her chest as she turned and walked up the grand staircase, the heavy gold ring on her finger feeling light and secure for the very first time since the wedding. She reached her bedroom and walked over to the tall windows that looked out over the dark harbor and the sleeping city of Boston. The fire was burning low in the hearth, casting a gentle warmth through the room that chased away the remaining winter chill. She looked out at the falling snow, thinking of the incredible journey that had brought her from a freezing, ruined parlor to the heart of this grand estate. And a soft smile touched her lips as she thought about the years that lay ahead of them. It was a strange thing to realize how quickly the world could change, how a moment of complete ruin could turn into the foundation for something beautiful and true. She had entered this marriage out of sheer desperation, seeking nothing more than a shield against the winter and the cruel words of a society that had abandoned her the moment her father's fortune vanished. She had expected to live out her days as a companion to a cold, distant stranger, a man who built walls of ice around his heart to protect himself from the pain of the past and the guilt of a sister he could not save. Yet, looking back at the past weeks, she could see that the white-haired master of the estate was not a monster to be feared, but a soul that had simply forgotten how to live in the light. He had given her safety, but in return she had given him a reason to open his doors to the world again, to break the silence of his dark halls and face the vulnerability that came with caring for another living person. They were an unlikely pair, a human woman with nothing but her pride and a creature of the night who held the power of the city in his pale hands, yet they had found a strange, perfect balance in each other's presence. The future was no longer a dark, terrifying blank space filled with creditors and whispers. It was a long, open road that they would walk together, learning from one another with every passing season. She knew there would be challenges, that his supernatural nature and her mortal life would bring difficult choices in the years to come. But she was no longer afraid of the dark or the cold, for she knew that as long as they faced the world with honesty and a willingness to try, the love growing between them would be strong enough to thaw the deepest winter and bring a lasting light to the darkest corners of their home.